Half of the steel used in American buildings, bridges, and cars comes from one place, Canada. But that supply chain, it just got cut in half. With a single announcement, the U.S. doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 25% to 50% without warning, no negotiation, and no heads up to its closest ally. On the surface, it sounds like just another trade dispute. But behind closed doors, this was something far more dangerous, a silent war between neighbors, a breakup that could unravel 80 years of trust, stability, and shared power. While most Americans were busy scrolling social media, a quiet shift began that could completely reshape the world. Canada didn't yell, it didn't threaten, it didn't even flinch. What it did next might be the most calculated geopolitical move of the decade. And if you're American, this story directly affects your wallet, your job, and your future. Because this isn't just about steel, it's about survival. Number 6. What lies ahead? Options, risks, redemption. The break between Canada and the U.S. isn't just a dramatic headline, it's a warning shot. But the story isn't finished yet. As the dust settles, both countries face a choice: double down on division or find a path back to trust. And right now, the clock is ticking. For Canada, the strategy is already unfolding. They're accelerating trade deals with Europe and Asia, pouring resources into domestic production and slowly untying the knots that once bound them to the American economy. It's not about revenge, it's about resilience. The goal isn't to punish the U.S., but to protect Canada from future shocks. If one tweet can shut down billions in trade, then dependence is a risk they can't afford to take again. But even as Canada builds new bridges, they're not burning the old ones. That's the brilliance of their strategy. They're positioning themselves to thrive with or without American cooperation. So if the U.S. comes back to the table, Canada will have leverage, real leverage, for the first time in decades. And what about the U.S.? The road ahead won't be easy. The tariffs may score political points at rallies, but the economic pain is real and growing. American factories are hurting. Construction projects are stalling, prices are rising, and sooner or later voters will feel it. The big risk? That Washington doesn't realize what it's lost until it's too late. But redemption is still possible. Alliances, even broken ones, can be rebuilt. Trust can be restored, but only through action, not slogans. That means clear policy, transparent communication, respect for partners who've stood by for generations. If the U.S. can show consistency, leadership, and genuine willingness to rebuild what's been damaged, there's still a window. But that window is closing because the world is moving on. Canada is moving on. And every day that passes, the old system fades a little more. What used to be unbreakable is now uncertain. And uncertainty in geopolitics creates opportunities for rivals, for competitors, for chaos. This is a moment of choice. America can adapt or be left behind. The next steps won't just define U.S.-Canada relations. They'll define whether America remains a trusted leader or becomes just another country watching from the sidelines. What we're witnessing isn't just a trade dispute. It's the unraveling of a decades-long alliance that once defined North American unity. Canada's pivot is more than policy. It's a signal to the world that trust in American leadership is no longer guaranteed. The question now is simple. Can the U.S. earn it back? Or is this the beginning of a new world where America stands alone? If you found this eye-opening, like the video, subscribe and hit the bell, because in our next episode, we're exposing China's silent moves to replace American leadership on the global stage. You won't want to miss it. Number 5, the bigger picture. Global order, multipolarity. What happened between the U.S. and Canada is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The tariff spike, the diplomatic rift, the economic fallout, they're all symptoms of something far more significant, a shifting global order. For decades, the United States sat at the center of the world stage. Its allies relied on its military, its markets, and its leadership. But now, those same allies are quietly exploring life without America at the core. And Canada's pivot might just be the clearest warning sign yet. For years, countries around the world have tolerated America's unpredictability, brushing off sudden policy changes, diplomatic walkouts, and tariff threats. But tolerance has a limit, and when the U.S. blindsided Canada, a peaceful neighbor sharing the world's longest undefended border, it sent a chilling message to every other ally watching: if this can happen to Canada, it can happen to anyone. And so, a new era is unfolding, one where global power is no longer concentrated in a single capital. The multipolar world isn't coming, it's already here. Countries like Germany and France are pushing for European strategic autonomy. Japan is strengthening ties with Southeast Asia. Even long-standing allies like South Korea are cautiously building trade bridges with China just in case. China, meanwhile, is seizing the moment. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, it's investing in infrastructure, forging economic deals, and offering alternatives to American-led systems. The European Union is doing the same, signing climate agreements, tech partnerships, and defense deals that exclude the U.S. entirely. America, once the architect of the global system, is watching that system reshape itself without its input. Canada's move to deepen alliances with Europe isn't just about trade, it's about values, stability, predictable, IT, mutual respect. Traits that used to define American leadership but have since become inconsistent. In a world facing rising authoritarianism, climate crises, and economic uncertainty, countries are looking for partners they can count on. And here's the hard truth: more and more of them no longer see the U.S. as that partner. This isn't just about one tariff or one broken alliance. It's about a slow, quiet unraveling of the global trust America spent 80 years building. And once that trust is gone, it doesn't come back easily. Number 4, impact on supply chains, real people. The fallout wasn't theoretical. It hit hard, fast, and close to home. When the U.S. doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, the headlines focused on political drama. But behind those headlines, something more serious was unraveling: North America's supply chains. These weren't abstract systems. They were lifelines, connecting factories, workers, families, and entire industries across the U.S.-Canada border. And overnight, those lifelines began to snap. In Michigan, auto plants that had relied on Canadian steel for decades suddenly faced a crisis. Deliveries were delayed, costs surged, and assembly lines ground to a halt. In Ohio, construction projects worth billions were either paused or scrapped altogether because the materials they'd counted on became too expensive or just didn't show up. And in Missouri, aerospace manufacturers building commercial jets and military aircraft began reporting shortages that threatened critical deadlines. These aren't minor disruptions. This is the kind of shock that reverberates across the economy. Canadian steel isn't just cheap, it's custom-made for U.S. standards. It's been tested, certified, and embedded into production systems that took decades to build. Replacing it with imports from other regions, like Asia or Eastern Europe, isn't a simple switch. It's a gamble. Different standards, different costs, different timelines, and in manufacturing, even a slight delay can snowball into millions in losses. But it wasn't just business executives who felt the pain. Real workers started losing jobs. In Hamilton, Ontario, once called the steel capital of Canada, plants that had thrived on U.S. contracts were forced to scale back. Families that had depended on cross-border trade for generations were left in limbo. Some companies laid off staff, others shut down entirely. The ripple effect. TS didn't stop there. In the U.S., higher steel costs translated into higher prices for cars, appliances, and construction materials. Infrastructure projects faced budget overruns. Small businesses struggled to adapt. What looked like a targeted trade policy had turned into a continental crisis. And the scariest part? Even if the tariffs were reversed tomorrow, the damage is already done. Supply chains run on trust. Once that trust is broken, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. Canadian exporters are already shifting to new markets, and U.S. buyers are scrambling for short-term fixes. This wasn't a temporary disruption. It was the beginning of a long, painful reset, one that millions of people never saw coming. Number 3, a pivot in diplomacy alliances. While America was busy tightening its grip, Canada was quietly slipping out of its hands. The tariff hike wasn't just an economic blow, it was a wake-up call. And Canada didn't hit snooze. Behind the scenes, a diplomatic pivot was already in motion, one that would shift not just Canada's future, but the entire balance of Western alliances. Instead of chasing Washington for answers, Canada turned its attention to Europe and Asia. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former central banker with a global reputation, wasted no time. He booked meetings, not in D.C., but in Brussels, Berlin, London, and Tokyo. While America doubled down on America First, Carney quietly promoted a new message, Canada Plus, a strategy built on stability, mutual respect, and long-term cooperation. In private rooms and strategic summits, Canada offered something powerful, trust, a nation that shows up, honors agreements, and doesn't change policy based on social media trends. European leaders, already weary of American unpredictability, were listening. And Canada, often overlooked in global power plays, suddenly became the reliable partner everyone wanted in their corner. This shift wasn't just about trade, it was deep geopolitical alignment. Canada expressed support for Europe's plans to develop independent defense capabilities, no longer just relying on NATO's US-led muscle. This wasn't anti-Americanism, it was insurance, because when your strongest ally becomes your biggest risk, you start building lifeboats before the ship sinks. And Canada didn't stop there. It began fast-tracking deals with Asian markets, India, Indonesia, South Korea, diversifying export routes and opening new trade lanes. This wasn't a backup plan. It was a blueprint for independence. Perhaps the most symbolic moment came when Carney delivered a speech in Paris declaring, "We are the most European of non-European countries." That single line sent a clear message. Canada sees its future not as a U.S. extension, but as a global player in its own right. While America isolated itself with tariffs and tension, Canada expanded its network with diplomacy and discipline. The world watched, and allies took note. If even Canada, America's closest neighbor, was stepping back, who would be next? The realignment had begun, not loudly, not with fireworks, but with handshakes, quiet deals, and a shift in global trust that would change everything. Number 2, Canada's response. Calm, calculated, strategic. Most countries, when blindsided like this, react fast and loud. Press conferences, fiery speeches, threats of retaliation. But not Canada. When the U.S. doubled tariffs overnight, Canada didn't raise its voice. It raised its game. Behind the scenes, leaders moved quickly but with precision. No chaos, no panic, just a quiet, calculated strategy that would catch even seasoned analysts off guard. First came the obvious move, retaliatory tariffs, billions of dollars worth. Canada hit back with duties on American goods ranging from steel to agricultural products. But even that was just a surface-level response, a warning shot, not a war cry. What mattered more was what Canada didn't do. No angry tweets, no emotional outbursts, no televised finger-pointing. Instead, they picked up the phone and started calling other capitals, not Washington, but Paris, Brussels, Tokyo, and Singapore. Canada's message was clear. We're not begging. We're building something new. Behind closed doors, Prime Minister Mark Carney and his team began a diplomatic sprint, realigning trade strategies, accelerating diversification, and laying the foundation for deeper ties with Europe and Asia. The goal? Reduce dependency on the U.S. and strengthen partnerships with countries that value stability and respect. And they didn't stop at trade. Canada also began discussions around defense independence, signaling support for European-led initiatives to build alternatives to U.S.-dominated military structures. At the same time, the Canadian government launched targeted support programs to shield domestic industries from the tariff shock. Steel and aluminum producers received subsidies, tax breaks, and access to new global markets. Trade envoys were dispatched to Southeast Asia to strike deals that would have taken years under normal conditions. But the urge, NC had changed everything. The tone was no longer, "we're all in this together," It was, we need to stand on our own. Even more telling was Canada's formal step to challenge the tariffs at the World Trade Organization, not with fire, but with facts. In doing so, they positioned themselves not as victims, but as rational actors defending the rules of international trade. While the U.S. appeared impulsive and aggressive, Canada appeared disciplined and forward-thinking. This wasn't just damage control, it was a geopolitical pivot. Canada had been pushed too far, and instead of swinging back, they stepped sideways, out of America's shadow and towards something much bigger. The breakup had begun, but this wasn't heartbreak, it was strategy. Number 1. The U.S. moves from 25% to 50%. It started with a tariff, just another line in a long list of trade policies. Back in 2018, the U.S. first slapped a 25% tax on steel imports under the banner of national security. Canada, America's closest ally and top steel supplier, was stunned but didn't panic. They adjusted, negotiated, and weathered the storm. But then came 2025. With no warning, no diplomatic talks, and no explanation, the U.S. announced it would double the tariff, from 25% to 50%, specifically targeting Canadian steel and aluminum. That single move didn't just raise taxes, it raised alarms around the world. This wasn't about economics anymore, it felt personal. The U.S. didn't consult, it didn't explain, it simply hit go and dropped a hammer on a partnership that's lasted for generations. For Canada, it was a punch in the gut. For global markets, it was a signal. America isn't playing by the old rules anymore. To understand how big this is, you need to look at the numbers. Over 50% of all steel used in U.S. construction, auto manufacturing, and aerospace comes from Canada. American factories have spent decades building supply chains around Canadian steel, tested, certified, and tailor-made for U.S. standards. You can't just replace that overnight, and yet, that's exactly what these new tariffs are forcing them to do. The U.S. framed it as protecting domestic jobs, but here's the twist. American steelmakers still rely on Canadian materials to meet demand. Cutting that off doesn't just hurt Canada, it hits U.S. industries hard. Within days of the announcement, reports started coming in. Delays at auto plants in Michigan, construction projects in Ohio grinding to a halt, even military contracts facing uncertainty as aerospace companies scrambled to source parts. But the most dangerous part of this move wasn't the economic damage, it was the message it sent. As if the U.S. is willing to blindside Canada, its closest ally, who's safe. The tariff hike wasn't just a policy shift, it was a trust collapse. Quietly, without a single shot fired, the longest undefended border in the world suddenly felt different, colder, tenser. What happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was something far more powerful. Because Canada didn't retaliate with emotion, they responded with strategy, and that's when everything started to change.